Well, another week, another Rail 200 event. Last weekend, Ashford Depot in Kent was thrown open to the public for a day of train shenanigans, so down I went. Ashford was originally the works for the South Eastern Railway, opening in 1847. Unfortunately, there's only one surviving South Eastern engine, and that was at Didcot this weekend. Anyway, Ashford became a massive industrial centre, with the town growing around the locomotive, carriage and wagon works. In 1899, the South Eastern Railway formed an alliance with their old rivals, the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, to form the South Eastern and Chatham Railway, and Ashford remained the works. The South Eastern and Chatham was taken over by the Southern Railway in 1823, and the Southern was taken over by British Railways in 1948, and Ashford remained a major site until its closure in 1982. The current depot is not the old works. It was opened in 2007 to service Hitachi's Class 395 Javelin trains, the trains built to work domestic services on the High-Speed 1 line, and it's operated under South Eastern. So it's more of a spiritual successor to the old works. That's not to say that South Eastern didn't take the opportunity to get some heritage rolling stock in, and we'll take a closer look at that later. I have to say, I was pretty impressed with the setup here. I arrived at the start of the day when the entry queue was longest, and I was in and through the ticket and bag checks very quickly. The entry ticket came with a little tote bag and a bottle of water, which I thought was an excellent idea. Running around a depot in the hot sun is thirsty work. I actually travelled down on a Javelin, and one of the highlights of the tour was one of the trains jacked off its bogies. Now I come to read that out, it sounds like a euphemism for someone who's taken a lot of cocaine. Oh man, that guy is jacked off his bogies. One of the trains raised off its wheels, which was a little bit weird to see. I can't really describe it, it just looks wrong to see something like that in the air. I was on firmer ground, figuratively and possibly literally, with this train. This is a Class 465, a networker, and you may recall seeing it in my recent video on the Greatest Gathering. You may also recall me freaking out because it's old enough to receive a heritage livery. In this case, a facsimile of the Network Southeast livery it wore when it was new. The first networkers were introduced in 1991, which, yes, does make them over 30 years old. They were part of Network Southeast's renewal of the commuter lines serving London and the South East, a replacement for the old slam-door trains. I know these days everything is iconic, but I do feel like these are an icon of the Network Southeast era, which is something that many people, myself included, feel something of a sense of nostalgia towards. These trains are starting to be replaced by Class 707s, but nevertheless they are still a common sight on South Eastern's services. Network Southeast colours could also be seen on this Class 73. Class 73s were first built in 1962 for use on the southern region of British Railways. They were commonly known as Electro-diesels, but these days we'd call them bi-mode. They could run off electricity from the third rail, or, where there was no third rail, off their diesel engines. They were also built to be able to run all over the southern network, including the problematic Hastings line. I well remember them on the Gatwick Express. They were so versatile and well designed that several of them are still in departmental use to this day. Some have even been refurbished into the Class 73/9 variant, so it looks like we won't be seeing the back of them for a long time yet, even after 6 decades. Speaking of old dogs that have been taught new tricks, here's a pair of Class 20s. When I did my video on the Greatest Gathering, I talked about the Class 17, which was a Type 1 diesel. Type 1s were smaller engines designed for lighter traffic. Many of the Type 1s that British Railways ordered were frankly pretty dreadful. The English Electric Type 1s, later known as the Class 20s, were the exception. English Electric didn't overthink the design, they produced something simple but powerful. They could work in multiple, so they could also handle heavier trains. The biggest problem was visibility. With only one cab, the driver had difficulty seeing past the bonnet. For preference, they'd work in reverse, and when two were operating together, they'd be coupled nose to nose. The kind of freight trains they were designed for don't really operate these days, but the Class 20s fill enough niches that they've stayed in service for way longer than anticipated. These ones are used on engineering trains. For context, the first Class 20s entered service in 1957, firmly within the steam age. I think if you're going to make a list of the greatest British diesels ever built, these must go somewhere near the top. This diesel, meanwhile, is a real oddity. If you remember my video on the Greatest Gathering, you might be thinking, that's a Class 08. Wrong, it's a Class 12. They're a sort of ancestor of the Class 08. So what happened was this. English Electric came up with a rather successful diesel shunting locomotive which they sold to the London, Midlands and Scottish Railway. There were various attempts to improve on that design by different railway companies, and this was one by the Southern Railway, designed by OVS Bulleid. Actually, it wasn't built until 1949, by which time the Southern had been nationalised. However, it was built at Ashford Works, so it's appropriate that it should be a guest here. Anyway, all these various similar but different diesels were superseded by the Class 08s. The biggest giveaway that this is a Class 12 is the so-called box-pock wheels, which Bulleid loved. And that should clue you in as to who designed Clanline here. Clanline is a rebuilt merchant navy class. They carried the names of shipping lines. They originally looked quite different. Bulleid designed them during the Second World War as an ultra-modern express locomotive, incorporating many innovations. These included chain-driven valve gear, a welded firebox, and an air-smoothed casing. Unfortunately, the valve gear leaked oil, the firebox cracked, and the casing gave terrible visibility for the crew. This aside, though, they were fast and powerful express engines, and so in the 1950s, British Railways had them rebuilt to alleviate the flaws. In this form, they lasted almost to the end of steam on British Railways. Clanline was rebuilt in 1959. It wears the regalia of the Golden Arrow, which was a luxury train from London to Dover. At Dover, passengers would board a ferry, then at Calais they'd catch the Flèche d'Or to Paris. The other steam engine present was Stepney, which is probably the most famous locomotive here, being as how it is literally a Thomas the Tank Engine character. Stepney has an interesting history which I'm thinking I'd like to cover in a separate video. For now, it is an A1X class, better known among rail fans as Terriers. These were designed for commuter trains in London, making them a kind of predecessor to the networkers, when you think about it. They were superseded by bigger engines, but the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway and its successors had plenty of uses for a small, punchy locomotive. Terriers were distributed all over the network, used for light duties like branch line trains and shunting. Stepney was saved for preservation by the Bluebell Railway, and this year turns 150. I love the Terriers. I think they're delightful little engines. Remember I mentioned that the Hastings line was problematic? Well, this is a train designed for use on that line. The problem with the Hastings line was that the contractors who built it cheaped out on the tunnels. In order to fix that, the tunnels ended up narrower than usual, which restricted the kinds of trains that could work it. The Schools-class steam locomotives were designed with this line in mind, and, as I said earlier, so were the Class 73s. This is a Class 202. It's a diesel multiple unit, because the line wasn't electrified, and it has a narrow body, unlike me. They had a distinctive engine noise which led to them being nicknamed thumpers. They were built between 1957 and 1958. When the Hastings line was electrified in 1986, these trains were taken out of service and the lines through the tunnels were reduced to single track, so normal-sized trains could be used on the line. The Class 69 is simultaneously an old engine and a new one. These are rebuilt from Class 56s, which first came into service in 1976. Basically, rebuilding Class 56s was GB Rail Freight's low-budget alternative to buying new locomotives. The Class 69s have a comparable power output to the Class 66s, like this one. Basically, they're Class 66s wearing the skin of a Class 56. They all wear unique liveries. This one was inspired by the one-off prototype locomotive Kestrel. There's a fair bit of on-track plant on display here too. This is a Placer and Thura? I'm certainly pronouncing that wrong. It's a Placer and Thura or Thura ballast tamper. What a tamper does is it tidies up the ballast, the stones that the railway track is laid on, to make the track level. This ensures that the ride is smooth and, importantly, safe. These you might have seen around the network in autumn and winter. This is a multi-purpose vehicle, or MPV. These are used for various engineering tasks. Basically, they're a kind of diesel multiple unit, but they have these flatbeds onto which different modules can be placed. These modules might be used for clearing leaves, for clearing ice, for clearing weeds, and for applying sandite, which is a material used to prevent rails from icing up. In short, they're the right kind of train for the wrong kind of snow. They've been used for other jobs too, like maintaining overhead wires, inspecting track, and they've even been trialled on carrying freight. You see them all over the place. Personally though, my favourite bit of plant equipment was this little Hunslet diesel shunter. What can I say? Tiny things please tiny minds. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more if that's your jam. I would like, as ever, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the track plant to my rail network. Thanks also to Southeastern for arranging this open day. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.